This project was really interesting. We had, again, just a very good collaboration between the ecologists. It was mainly ecologists, landscape designers, and the coastal engineers. So because this was obviously a coastal project, there was lots of consideration given to the basic function of the shoreline is to protect the land behind. So we had to make sure that anything that we were designing would serve that kind of basic function as well, and wasn't just going to get washed away in the first big typhoon that we had. So basically, this project, if you look at the history of this, the Tung East Newtown extension, there was an EIA done for this project. The Eco-shoreline was a recommendation in the EIA. So it said, when we're doing this reclamation, we should try and see if we can design the shoreline to add some ecological value. So that was a requirement of the environmental permit. But there was not much detail given in the permit as to how that should be achieved. It was just, this is what we should try and do. So Stephen and myself worked very closely to come up with some different design options that, might be able to meet those permit requirements. So this was from the we started from nothing, basically. There's no design there when we first started. Yeah. When we're starting these projects as an ecologist, the first thing I'll do is to do some research and benchmarking to see what other academic research or built projects have been applied internationally or locally, to see what the existing research in this field have been. And so we did look at a range of, we had like a working paper that we looked at all of the literature review for this topic, and summarized all of that information in a working paper, which kind of set the framework for how we would approach our design. So that's a very typical ecology approach or scientific approach, is you do all of your baseline research, and then maybe a little bit different to how a landscape designer would approach the project. Yeah. From the very beginning, Stephen and myself had a pretty good idea that we wanted to try and create those 3 different typologies. And this was in response to what we knew about the site. We knew certain areas there was no space to do a sloping wall, so it had to be a vertical wall. And then for the areas with the sloping wall, we knew some areas were going to be a lot more sheltered than others. So we maybe have potential to do mangrove planting in those more sheltered areas and create a different typology, this kind of rocky shore typology, in other areas. So I think the rocky shoreline is probably the easiest to explain. So from the research that we'd done in terms of ecology, we knew that you can add a lot of value by creating kind of rock pools that would retain the water when the tide retreats at the low tide period. And then also in adding a lot of, again, structural diversity to the surface treatments of those blocks, adds a lot of small niches that different animals could use. So, we had some basic ideas about how what would add value to that type of shoreline. We then discussed this with the landscape designers and their team to see how we could actually translate this into a design. And I think one thing to bear in mind for this project as well is that it was a really big project. It's a substantial area that we had to accommodate. So what we designed had to be relatively easy to build and also relatively cheap. I mean, it couldn't be a very, very difficult design. So that was something I think Stephen and his team did a great job in terms of translating those ideas. How do we create this system of blocks that has a lot of structural diversity, but at the same time is quite easy to build, using some, 4 or 5 different models, different groups of blocks. You can group those together in different ways to create slightly different environments, which gives you a lot of kind of structural complexity, but at the same time is quite a buildable design as well. Once we had those designs as well, those kind of prototypes, that had to be, we talked to our coastal engineers to make sure that those structures were going to be stable and resilient during storm events. So there's, the engineers can tell you exactly, how much things need to weigh if they're not going to get washed away. So we had some input from them in terms of sizing the blocks and how they should be configured to make sure that the whole structure was going to be stable. I mean, there were minor changes. For example, for the mangrove eco-shoreline, originally we just had some very simple wall structure at the seaward side. But then after we talked to our coastal engineers, we realized that that was going to be too small a structure. So they recommended a much bigger blocks, which we didn't really want, but we had to include, because they were more stable. I mean, other things as well for the eco-shoreline, the rocky eco-shoreline, originally we were considering using rock for that. But then, looking at the size of the project and the cost, and also the feasibility of that, we decided to go with concrete in the end. We had a special mix of concrete, which is designed to be less toxic to marine life. So it's actually a special mix that we used. But using rock would have been a nicer finish, but just getting all of the blocks into shape and assembling that whole thing in rock would have been very, very expensive. And also, if you're going to use the rock, we did quite a bit of research on this actually. The rock that was actually from that region, from Tung region, is actually a very hard granite. So if you're going to, it's impossible to work it into the shapes that we wanted. Because if it had been a softer rock like a sandstone, it would have been much easier to work with. But it seemed to be, it's kind of just went against the grain of what we were trying to do, to bring in a load of rock that was from somewhere else to create a kind of very artificial landscape. It would have been better to use the kind of native rock in that area. But when we looked at the characteristics of that rock, it seemed like it was not going to be feasible to use. Yeah. So for this project, it is interesting that under the original contract, there was no site trial, no experiments at all to make sure the whole thing worked. So we did ask the client, could we do, we're quite confident with our design, but we better try it before we build the whole thing. So we did a sort of small site trial in close to the project site. For the rocky eco-shoreline, I think one of the issues we had was it proved to be very difficult to position the blocks with enough precision to get the whole thing to work properly. And we couldn't get them to, because it was they had to be positioned from a barge, which is kind of rocking around. It's very, very difficult to line them up very, very precisely. So there was some tweaks to the design to address that problem and make sure that we could build those kind of rock pools that would function very, very efficiently as part of the final design. For the site trial, a couple of things that we did find problems that we had with the mangroves was, well, not really problems. I mean, it's just a good thing to find out from the site trial. We trialed, I think, 6 or 7 species of mangrove, and it seems like 3 or 4 of those just didn't grow at all in the site trial. So I think maybe the conditions in those, because it's quite a difficult place for a mangrove to grow, I think we need to make sure that we're selecting quite resilient species when we're doing the planting for the overall project. So that was another good outcome from the site trial, I think. It enabled us to identify which species were going to be more successful for the actual project. It was over a year. Yeah, it's definitely about a year and a half. Yeah, so because this, as mentioned for the previous projects, because this is a designated project in Hong Kong, there will be a lot of monitoring. So we'll do ecological monitoring of all of the different types of eco-shoreline and then compare that to reference data to see if we have any improved performance of the eco-shoreline. And this is going to cover many, many different aspects of ecology and environment. So there'll be water quality monitoring. We'll be monitoring the intertidal organisms, the avifauna, the mangroves, any fish that are occurring in the area will also be monitored. So we should have a very good data set after the project is completed to enable us to see what their performance would be overall. This is probably just the start for Hong Kong. There's many other different reclamation projects in planning stage. There's also there's huge amounts of existing seawall in Hong Kong that potentially could be redesigned, incorporating some of these measures. And I think this has been a very successful first step in that process.